At 08:58 a.m., October 24, 1944, somewhere above the Philippine Sea, Commander David McCampbell did something no fighter ace should ever do. He climbed toward 90 enemy aircraft, alone, with only one wingman limping behind him. The paradox was brutal and immediate. Every manual, every instructor, every scrap of combat logic insisted that climbing into a larger force meant suicide. But McCampbell wasn't climbing to fight them. He was climbing to disappear. Far below, the U.S. carrier Essex shuddered under the roar of scrambling aircraft. Spotters shouted bearings. Gunners spun turrets. Deck crews pointed at a dark ribbon of specks approaching from the west. Japanese bombers, dozens of them, were lining up for a killing strike. If they broke through, the carrier group would be gutted. That was the certainty. The uncertainty was who would stop them. McCampbell had barely strapped in before he noticed the anomaly. The enemy formation was flying directly into the rising sun, their silhouettes dim, their wings shimmering with heat distortion. It was a narrow window, bright, blinding, perfect. He pushed his throttle forward. His Hellcat heaved upward, groaning under the strain, but climbing anyway. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, called out that his guns were jammed. McCampbell didn't slow. He didn't even acknowledge it. At that altitude, acknowledgement meant delay, and delay meant losing the light. He only needed one thing: height. The paradox grew sharper as he climbed. Rising toward an enemy should expose a pilot. But McCampbell understood the physics better than anyone in the Pacific. Up there, with the sun boiling white behind him, he wasn't exposing himself. He was erasing himself. His aircraft became a dark dot fused with glare. His approach became invisible. His dive, when it came, would carry more speed than any bomber could counter. The Japanese would never see him until his tracers were already cutting through their engines. As he reached the upper limit of his climb, the world inverted. The horizon dipped, the ocean turned silver, and the bomber stream beneath him drifted into a slow, predictable arc. 90 planes, 9 full squadrons of Yokosuka D4Y Judies and A6M Zeros escorting them, each one capable of burning a carrier to the waterline. And he, the lone American fighter with guns that actually worked, was hanging above them like a blade that hadn't yet decided where to fall. Wind hissed through his canopy. The sun glared hard enough to bleach the cockpit instruments. McCampbell inhaled once, slow and steady. No panic, no tremor, no theatrics. Just calculation, the cold arithmetic of altitude, angle, and velocity. He tilted the Hellcat's nose slightly, lining up the first bomber in the formation. Below him, the Japanese pilot squinted forward, blinded by the same sun that now hid the deadliest man in the U.S. Navy. And then, one impossible detail. A trick so simple it bordered on absurdity. Japanese doctrine discouraged pilots from looking directly into the sun during patrol approach. It strained the eyes, it masked silhouettes, it created blind spots. For McCampbell, that blind spot was the doorway. An entire bomber group, veterans, some of them, were flying with their vision narrowed at the exact moment a U.S. ace positioned himself in the only place they wouldn't look. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was the sunblind dive, an energy tactic that turned physics into camouflage. He had used it before, but never against odds like these. Never with a carrier's survival hanging by a thread. Never with the sky so crowded that it felt like a second ocean. He eased his throttle back. The engine muted into a low vibration. Gravity pulled at the Hellcat, nudging it downward. The dive was seconds away. But first came the moment McCampbell valued most. The silent pause before descent, the brief suspension in which everything slows, everything sharpens, and every decision becomes irreversible. He watched the nearest Japanese bomber drift into perfect alignment. Its dorsal gunner scanned the horizon lazily, unaware that death sat directly above him. Other bombers tightened their formation, unaware that their tightness made them easier targets. The escorts weaved gently on either flank, unaware that they were guarding the wrong quadrant of the sky entirely. McCampbell's gloved hand tightened around the control stick. His thumb hovered over the firing switch. His oxygen mask scraped faintly as he exhaled. Below him lay 90 planes. He would not fight 90. He would fight one, then another, then another. Each kill a product of angles and timing, not rage or bravado. One man, one machine, one technique. At 08:59 a.m., he rolled the Hellcat over. The sun exploded across his canopy. The world dropped into a blur of altitude and acceleration. The dive began. Silent, steep, invisible. Gravity snapped tight around him. The wind screamed. The bomber beneath him ballooned larger, clearer, doomed. In 10 minutes, 9 enemy aircraft would fall from the sky. But at this exact second, no one, not the escorts, not the carrier below, not even McCampbell himself, knew how many he would take before the sun stopped shielding him. He pressed his thumb on the trigger. At 08:59:03 a.m., before the first burst of his guns had even faded into the slipstream, the full scale of the threat finally revealed itself. From his steep descent, the Japanese formation no longer looked like distant insects on the horizon. It looked like a moving city of wings, a layered, disciplined column stretching nearly a mile across the sky. Bombers in the center, fighters on the flanks. More shapes materializing behind them, as if the morning light were birthing new shadows. McCampbell's first target erupted into flame, its wing tearing loose in a spiral of burning fabric and smoke. The bomber fell away, but the formation did not scatter. They did not panic. The enemy didn't even know what had hit them. The paradox sharpened again. An attack from such close range, delivered so suddenly, should have startled the entire group. But coming out of the sun, the shot was almost invisible. The bomber's destruction looked, at a distance, like mechanical failure, not enemy fire. And that misunderstanding bought McCampbell seconds. Only seconds, but seconds in air combat can cascade into survival. He flattened momentarily, letting the wind shear past the canopy. Beneath him, the glittering ocean reflected the silhouettes of 90 aircraft like a second formation flying upside down. To starboard, 2 Zeros finally began climbing to investigate the disturbance. They scanned left, right, below, everywhere except the one place that mattered. They dipped their noses suspiciously, unaware that the attacker was already repositioning above their blind arc. McCampbell pulled the Hellcat upward again, climbing not to escape, but to reload the geometry of the fight. His aircraft shuddered with the strain. His airspeed bled away. It didn't matter. He needed height more than speed. Speed could be rebuilt in a dive. Height could not. And height was the currency he traded better than anyone in the Pacific. The Japanese column continued advancing toward the American fleet, toward the carriers, the destroyers, the helpless deck crews staring skyward. Radio chatter spiked across the task group. Enemy formation still inbound. Where are our fighters? Multiple waves, repeat, multiple. The fleet saw the threat, but not the ghost that had just sliced the first piece from it. McCampbell leveled briefly at the top of his climb. Sweat gathered across his brow despite the cold. His breathing steadied. The sun burned behind him again, bleaching out the world in a golden haze. And below, now slightly farther, slightly wider, the Japanese squadrons drifted like a river of shadows. He counted them in his mind. He knew the type. Judies, dive bombers with high speed but vulnerable tails. Zeros, agile, lethal, but fragile under 50 cal fire. And all of them locked into their attack pattern. Tight, predictable, disciplined. That discipline was their strength. But today it was also their weakness. Predictability has no defense against the unseen. As he angled his plane into the next dive, an escort Zero suddenly twitched upward, as if some instinct had brushed across its pilot's spine. The fighter jerked left, scanning the sky. Was it luck? Was it intuition? The Japanese ace seemed to sense something was wrong. But again, he never looked into the sun. His eyes swept every quadrant except the one that held the danger. McCampbell exhaled. His thumb settled over the trigger. The second dive initiated. Steeper, faster, louder. The wind clawed at the fuselage. The horizon snapped upward. He could already see the next bomber's canopy glinting like a bead of glass. He aligned his gun sight not at the fuselage nor the wing root, but at the junction where the metal stress lines converged. An engineer's instinct wrapped inside a warrior's timing. He fired. Tracer lines tore through the air like threads of molten copper. They struck the bomber's fuel cell. A white flash. A bloom of flame. then debris scattering across the formation like shrapnel from a fallen star. This time the enemy reacted. The nearest Zeros snapped violently into defensive arcs. Gunners swiveled. The bomber column rippled as pilots craned upward, struggling to peer through the blinding glare. They saw nothing. Only sun. Only brightness. Only the afterimage of their own confusion. But confusion was enough. The formation widened, not breaking fully but distorting just enough to create gaps. And gaps were the one thing McCampbell needed more than altitude. They were entrances. As he climbed again, pushing the Hellcat toward the sky with brutal precision, the Japanese formation changed shape below him, shifting from an invulnerable spear point into something more permeable, more vulnerable, more exposed to exactly the kind of attack he was engineering. The enemy had finally realized they were being hunted. They just hadn't realized how, or by whom. Far below, the American fleet braced for impact, unaware that one man was carving chunks from the incoming firestorm. Every second he delayed the bombers was another second the fleet had to prepare, reposition, and survive. But timing was slipping. Distance was closing. The Japanese were still moving forward, still bearing down on the American carriers with deadly purpose. McCampbell reached the peak of his climb again. The sun wrapped around him like a cloak. He turned the Hellcat into its third dive. He knew the truth now. This wasn't a battle to destroy 90 bombers. It was a battle to buy minutes, just minutes, for the fleet below. Minutes purchased with altitude and paid for in dives. At the exact moment McCampbell tipped his Hellcat into its third dive, the world compressed into speed and sunlight. Yet inside that blinding descent, another landscape flickered. One built not from clouds or gunfire, but from memory. A younger McCampbell, years earlier, sitting alone in the dim light of a flight hangar, studying aircraft reports long after the other pilots had gone. He had been searching for a pattern no one else cared to find. Not courage, not instinct, geometry, energy, blind spots. Most pilots learn to dogfight by feel. He learned by angles, by numbers, by the physics of falling objects and rising sun. His instructors had called him obsessive. His peers joked he flew like a mathematician pretending to be a warrior. But the Pacific didn't want warriors. It wanted engineers of survival. And the sun. Most pilots feared it. It washed out instruments. It hid threats. It stole depth perception. But McCampbell had eventually realized something no textbook spelled out. The sun wasn't an obstacle. It was a weapon. A white curtain so bright it erased everything behind it. A perfect blindfold for an enemy trained to avoid ruining his eyesight before a bombing run. That discovery didn't come in a dramatic epiphany. It came during a routine climb in training, when the glare swallowed him whole, and a trailing pilot complained over the radio. "Dave, I lose you every time you're quartered against the sun. You just disappear." Most would have brushed off the comment. McCampbell filed it away like a secret blueprint. Years later, as combat intensified across the Pacific, that blueprint hardened into Doctrine, his own private doctrine, built on 4 silent truths of aerial combat. Altitude is stored energy. Speed is stored advantage. Surprise is stored survival. The sun stores all 3 at once. And now, returning to the present, he was using those rules exactly as he had imagined in that hangar. Not to fight like a predator, but to vanish like a shadow. The Hellcat vibrated under acceleration, its heavy frame cutting downward through the blinding envelope of light. The third bomber swelled into view, climbing slightly to correct formation spacing. The Japanese gunner scanned frantically, but again, his field of view excluded the upper quadrant drenched in glare. The paradox sharpened yet again. The safest place in the sky was also the place no one dared look toward. McCampbell squeezed the trigger. 3 short bursts, no more than a second each. A discipline he had learned from studying gun camera footage late at night. Wasting ammunition meant wasting opportunities. The bomber's right engine exploded first. Then the entire aircraft veered left, wobbling like a wounded hawk before tipping into a spiraling dive that carved a corkscrew into the ocean below. Wreckage trailed behind it, fanning out in a glittering arc. McCampbell didn't watch it fall. Watching was for later, for safety, for confirmation. But confirmation consumed time, and time now was bleeding away like fuel in a punctured tank. Instead, he began climbing again. Slow, brutal, deliberate. Below him, the enemy formation had lost its perfect symmetry. It stretched, contracted, twisted in subtle but significant ways. Pilots barked orders over internal radios. Escorts drifted out of position, searching for a threat they could not interpret. The rigid architecture of the bomber group, its backbone, began to crack, and each crack widened the possibility of stopping them. As his Hellcat clawed upward, McCampbell recalled a lesson from his earliest days as a flight instructor before the war. Most pilots lose fights because they think in straight lines. A battle is never straight. It bends, it folds. Whoever shapes the fold wins. That concept had seemed theoretical then. Now it guided every adjustment of his throttle, every dip of his wings, every recalculated attack vector. He wasn't meeting the enemy head-on. He didn't need to. He was shaping the fold of 90 aircraft by cutting them one at a time from above, exploiting the space their doctrine refused to acknowledge. As he pitched upward once more, sunlight washed across the cockpit, blurring the instruments until only the red needles remained visible. The Hellcat felt heavier now. Heat from the engine radiated into the cabin. His heartbeat steadied into a slow rhythm that matched the climb. The next attack had to be more precise. The formation, though wounded, was adapting. That was the danger. Enemy pilots tightened their arcs. Escorts began guarding the upper quadrants. But not well. Not consistently. They had never trained for this angle of assault. They expected lateral threats, not vertical phantoms falling from a star. Through the glare, McCampbell saw another bomber sliding into range. But this one had adjusted formation slightly, angled to minimize exposure. Its gunner scanned almost directly toward him. Not fully, not enough to see him, but enough to force McCampbell to adjust his approach. He rolled left, repositioning into a steeper dive, one that would push his airframe dangerously close to structural limits. But survival demanded precision, and precision sometimes demanded recklessness disguised as math. He pressed into the dive. The ocean tilted upward like a rising wall. Air screamed against the canopy. The bomber's tail flashed into view. He fired. A clean, brutal burst. The tail gunner snapped backward, the aircraft pitched nose down, and smoke trailed in long ribbons behind its fuselage. 3 bombers gone, the formation weakening, the fleet still in danger. As he pulled out of the dive, G-forces crushed him into the seat. His vision narrowed briefly, gray shadows at the edge, the first hint of tunnel vision. He forced a breath, shook his head once, and the world widened again. 10 minutes. That was all he had. 10 minutes to break a formation built to destroy fleets. 10 minutes to wield a tactic no manual had ever described. Below, the bomber group pressed on. Above them, the sun burned like a silent accomplice. And somewhere between those layers of light and death, McCampbell angled his Hellcat for the next strike. At 09:02 a.m., as McCampbell leveled out from another crushing pull of G-force, the cockpit trembled, and a thin metallic rattle echoed through the frame, a reminder that even steel had limits. But the man inside the aircraft had limits of a different kind, shaped long before this sky, long before these 90 shadows threatened the fleet below. He had not been born a prodigy. He had not entered the war as some legend in waiting. In truth, David McCampbell began as one of the most unlikely pilots in the U.S. Navy. Quiet, methodical, not the loud, fearless archetype Hollywood would one day imagine. He earned the nickname Quiet Dave because he rarely raised his voice, even in chaos. Where other pilots bragged, he studied. Where others chased adrenaline, he chased patterns. The sky was his chessboard, and long before he ascended into the blinding sun above the Philippine Sea, he had already learned that flying wasn't about violence. It was about geometry and motion. But that understanding came at a price. Years earlier, as a cadet, he had nearly washed out of flight school. His instructors said he hesitated too much, that he thought too deeply, that combat required instinct, not analysis. One instructor wrote on his evaluation, "McCampbell will never be a natural fighter pilot. He calculates too much." But calculation, cold, silent calculation, was precisely what saved him. A few months later, during a training engagement, 2 cadets collided during a mock dogfight and plummeted into the sea. McCampbell wasn't involved, but he witnessed the tragedy. And in that moment, he made a quiet vow. He would never fight a battle he didn't fully understand. Not emotionally, not impulsively, mechanically. He studied aircraft silhouettes until he could identify them by the angle of a wingtip. He studied gun camera film until he recognized the precise second when an enemy committed to a turn he could not exit. He memorized climb rates, turn radii, stall characteristics, facts other pilots dismissed as trivia. To him, these traits were vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. What made him unique wasn't fearlessness, it was patience. Patience in a field where patience often got men killed. And yet, paradoxically, that same patience was what allowed him to survive engagements far more chaotic than the one unfolding beneath him now. In 1943, he was promoted to fighter commander aboard the Essex. Not because he was the fastest, not because he was the most daring, but because he was the man pilots trusted with the impossible, calculating order from airborne madness. When rookies panicked during their first dogfights, McCampbell didn't shout at them. He guided them with quiet, steady commands. When formations dissolved under sudden enemy attack, he didn't bark orders. He shaped them with simple instructions that reassembled chaos into structure. He was a tactician first, a killer second, and that made him lethal. When he first developed the rudimentary version of the sunblind dive, it wasn't meant to be heroic. It was meant to be efficient, to let gravity, light, and doctrine do most of the work, to turn his aircraft into a falling ghost and himself into a mathematician of speed. Now, in 1944, that odd combination, shy cadet turned analytical commander, was the only thing standing between 90 bombers and the American task group struggling below. As he reached the top of his climb once more, the sun flared against his canopy, masking the formation beneath him in a halo of shimmering white. His breathing steadied. His grip loosened, not because he relaxed, but because the next part required total precision. In the present, the Japanese formation twisted again, increasingly fractured, but still deadly. 2 zeros arced upward this time, finally attempting to guard the solar quadrant. Their engines growled as they climbed, black silhouettes cutting across the brightness. But even now, McCampbell noticed something important, something subtle. They weren't climbing enough. They were still below the glare line, still searching angles that wouldn't reveal him. Other pilots might have engaged the escorts in a dogfight, but dogfights waste energy. Dogfights burn altitude. Dogfights drag chaos into geometry. McCampbell refused to dogfight today. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to outmaneuver 90 planes. He was here to outthink them. That was why he was unique. Not speed, not bravery, not a predatory instinct, but a calm, surgical understanding that the sky is not won by the strongest pilot. It is won by the one who bends the rules of visibility and physics in his favor. Now, as he aligned his Hellcat once more, that quiet cadet, the one teachers once dismissed, prepared to strike again. And below him, the next bomber drifted into the only place in the sky where it should never have flown, the center of his gun sight. McCampbell rolled his aircraft into its fourth dive. Gravity answered. Light shielded him. The formation opened. And the man once told he thought too much, prepared to destroy another machine in under 3 seconds. At 09:03 a.m., when McCampbell tipped the Hellcat into its fourth dive, the sky changed character. What had been a battlefield of shapes and distances a moment earlier now snapped into violent clarity. The Japanese formation, once neat, once disciplined, had turned into a churning mass of shifting silhouettes. Gunner positions spun wildly. Escorts bled altitude in confused arcs. Bombers tightened their spacing 1 second and widened it the next, unable to decide which direction offered safety. Below them, the American fleet looked impossibly small. The carriers carved thin wakes through the Philippine Sea, the destroyers flanking them like steel shepherds. From this height, the fleet seemed fragile, almost toy-like, little more than drifting rectangles against the vastness of blue. Yet every man aboard those ships knew the truth. If even a handful of those bombers reached them, men would burn, steel would melt, and decks would split apart like paper. The risk sharpened into something tangible. The Japanese formation was still advancing. They had lost aircraft, but not momentum. The bombers continued their slow, deadly crawl toward the fleet, unaware that each passing second tightened the fuse burning beneath them. As McCampbell fell through the sunlight, the roaring wind hammered his canopy, vibrating through his bones. His Hellcat cut the dive like a blade, heavy, fast, untraceable. The sun behind him turned his aircraft into a silhouette wrapped in glare, masking him from any pilot who dared to look upward. But now, the risk shifted from enemy eyesight to something more dangerous, the escort's instinct. For the first time, a pair of Zeros had broken formation properly and begun climbing above the glare line. Not far enough, not fast enough, but close. A few more seconds, a few more degrees of climb, and they would see him. He knew the truth pilots hated to admit. Visibility kills as surely as bullets. A single glimpse of his Hellcat would collapse the tactic entirely. The escorts would swarm. He would lose altitude first, then speed, then the battle. And the fleet below would face 90 bombers without him. He corrected the angle by a hair's breadth. The fourth bomber swelled in his gun sight. He ignored the escorts. He ignored the gunners. He ignored the instinct screaming at him that the climb above him was narrowing, that the window was shrinking. He fired. A burst so short it felt like a breath. The rounds connected, clean, sequential, surgical. The bomber belched smoke from its left engine, staggered sideways, and fell in a slow, almost gentle roll toward the sea. 4 down. But the risk didn't diminish. It gathered. As he pulled out of the dive, G-force crushed his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. His peripheral vision narrowed into a tunnel of gray static. For a heartbeat, the ocean and sky blurred together into an indistinguishable haze. He forced his breathing steady, blinking hard until the horizon returned. And that's when he saw it, the shift that made the danger immediate. The bomber formation had finally, truly understood that they were being hunted from above. Escorts peeled upward, gunners locked in a vertical sweep. The entire right wing of the formation swung defensively, trying to shield the bomber's vulnerable arcs. The Japanese commander was adjusting. Their reaction was late, but not too late. Every climb he made from this moment forward would be contested. Every second spent regaining altitude would expose him. Every dive would have to be more precise than the last. The paradox of the sunblind dive re-emerged. The tactic was invincible, until the enemy realized what quadrant to watch. Now that they were learning, his risk spiked into something razor-thin, almost mathematical in its cruelty. If he dove too early, he'd lose energy. If he dove too late, the escorts would intercept him on the climb. If he waited at the peak, sunlight might shift, glare might weaken, clouds might interfere. He had minutes left, maybe less. Wind tore through the seams of his canopy as he began yet another ascent. Slower this time, heavier, the Hellcat complaining under the strain. Below him, the escorts climbed. Not well, not coordinated, but persistently. And beneath them all, the bomber stream pressed forward, still locked onto its target, the Essex and the ships that depended on her. For the first time since the engagement began, McCampbell felt the pressure of the clock inside his chest, not just in the geometry of the sky. He tightened his grip on the throttle, feeling sweat collect in his gloves. He risked a glance downward. The bombers had already covered miles since his first strike. Their altitude remained high. Their spacing remained effective. Their determination remained unbroken. One man was delaying an airborne tidal wave, but the tide was still coming. He pushed the Hellcat higher. The sun wrapped around him again. The glare returned. His silhouette vanished. The escorts were climbing, yes, but not fast enough. Not yet. He angled his wings. One bomber drifted into alignment. His breathing slowed. He prepared for the fifth dive. The sky tightened. The risk sharpened. The window narrowed. And still he dove. At 09:04 a.m., just seconds after beginning his climb for the fifth strike, McCampbell finally faced a moment he had been anticipating with cold inevitability. The point where instinct alone could not carry him further. The Japanese formation had adapted. The escorts were clawing upward with desperate urgency. The bombers tightened their spacing. The sky, which once felt wide and malleable, was now closing around him like a fist. So he paused, not physically, but mentally, inside the climb. He didn't hesitate. He calculated. Wind hammered the canopy. The Hellcat vibrated under the strain of altitude loss and regained lift. But in the rising furnace of sunlight around him, McCampbell quietly reconstructed the battlefield in his mind. Not the battlefield the enemy saw, but the one he felt. A shifting grid of energy states, angles of approach, threat cones, and flashes of vulnerability. From the deck of the Essex, officers watching through binoculars saw nothing but chaos. Tiny dots colliding, separating, merging again. But from where McCampbell climbed, the geometry began to reveal itself. Patterns emerged, gaps, moments, fractions of seconds where the formation bent just slightly out of sync. Those fractions were the plan. He had designed the sunblind dive for single attacker advantage, but never at this scale, never against 90 aircraft, never under a countdown measured in miles rather than minutes. Yet everything about the tactic still held, as long as he stayed invisible. And invisibility depended on three converging conditions. Altitude must stay above the glare line. The sun must remain behind him at a stable angle. The escorts must climb unevenly enough to leave a seam. Lose any one of those, and the entire battlefield collapsed around him. He rechecked the sun's angle, higher now, hotter, but still aligned with his ascent vector. Good. Another few minutes and the glare would fade, but not yet. He scanned the escorts, 4 climbing incorrectly, 2 climbing well, 1 climbing too aggressively. That one worried him. It was the first enemy pilot today whose behavior suggested genuine understanding. A pilot who wasn't following orders or doctrine, someone thinking independently, someone dangerous. Then he assessed the bomber spacing, tight in the center, looser along the left wing. That looseness meant inefficiency. Inefficiency meant opportunity. Finally, he considered his ammunition. He had been firing short bursts, conserving as much as he could. But even so, he had already spent nearly a quarter of his load. He had maybe 6 clean attacks left, 7 if he stretched the risk. After that, he would be diving with empty guns, a ghost without teeth. 6 attacks, 90 bombers. It didn't matter. He only needed the right 6. The plan began to crystallize. First, hit the loose wing. If he collapsed the left side of the formation, the Japanese commander would have to reposition his escorts to fill the gap, pulling their climb arcs out of place. Second, force a stagger. Destroying 2 bombers on the same wing would create a ragged edge, making the entire formation slow slightly as pilots instinctively corrected spacing. A slowing formation meant more seconds for the American fleet to prepare. Third, trap the aggressive escort. A sudden, unpredictable dive angle, something off-pattern, could lure the thinking enemy pilot into climbing past the glare line at the wrong moment, revealing his silhouette for McCampbell to avoid or outrun. Fourth, buy time. The only thing the fleet needed. The only thing the Japanese formation could not afford to give. He didn't need to win, he needed to delay. But paradoxically, delaying required absolute aggression. The Hellcat's engine strained as he reached the peak of his climb. He checked the sun again, still directly behind him. The glare shimmered across the canopy like molten silver. Below him, the sky looked darker now, more defined. The bomber wing he targeted drifted left, widening slightly, just as predicted. The air thinned. His breathing deepened in short, controlled pulls. Sweat collected beneath his flight suit. His hands steadied on the controls, tightening with familiarity rather than tension. For a brief moment, a moment too small for fear to enter, everything aligned. The sun, the distance, the spacing, the clock. Even the escorts climbing below him seemed to pause, hung for an instant in a perfect, lethal geometry. McCampbell tilted the Hellcat's nose downward. The dive vector locked in. He whispered, quietly, instinctively. Not a prayer, not a curse, but a calculation. 2 seconds, then fire. Gravity seized the fighter. The sun vanished behind him. The glare collapsed. The bomber wing rose into perfect clarity. He dove with a precision that felt surgical. The plan was no longer preparation. The plan was now motion. At 09:05 a.m., the 5th dive began not as a maneuver, but as a countdown, a razor-thin sequence of seconds that would determine whether the Essex and her escorting ships survived the next quarter hour. As McCampbell's Hellcat knifed downward, the world contracted into a sliding tunnel of rushing air, burning sunlight, and 3 lethal variables: speed, angle, and timing. The bomber wing he targeted drifted just where he expected it to. Loose, imperfect, vulnerable. But vulnerability meant nothing without precision. From this altitude, every half-second changed the shot. Every shift of wind altered the arc. And somewhere below, climbing out of the lower haze, the aggressive Japanese escort was rising again, hunting the space where a phantom attacker might be. But the escort still didn't know the truth. McCampbell wasn't descending toward the bomber. He was descending toward the moment, a sliver of time so thin it was barely measurable. T-5 seconds. Wind screamed across the canopy. McCampbell flexed his gloved fingers once, loosening tension without slowing the dive. His eyes locked onto the bomber's tail, not the fuselage. Tails were weak points. Hit the tail, the aircraft lost control instantly. Hit the engine, it might limp on long enough to release its bomb load. He didn't have time for limps. T-4 seconds. The aggressive escort twitched upward, its pilot catching a flicker of something. Maybe a glint, maybe nothing. But the instinct was there. This one was different. Not following Doctrine, reacting to something he couldn't yet name. The escort's climb arc shifted slightly, aligning with the general quadrant of the glare. Not enough to spot McCampbell, but enough to threaten interception on the climb out. The window tightened. T-3 seconds. The bomber moved into full profile, a fatally stable silhouette. The dorsal gunner finally rotated upward, straining his eyes against the sun's edge. For a split heartbeat, McCampbell saw the gunner's face tilt toward him, blind, searching, unseeing, still invisible, still above the glare line, but just barely. T-2 seconds. The bomber's wing wavered, just a correction against crosswind. But to McCampbell, that tiny wobble was everything. It meant the pilot was tense. It meant the formation was losing confidence. And confidence was the glue that kept large groups from fracturing under pressure. Once confidence cracked, formations collapsed. He held fire. He waited. One more second. T-1. The escort suddenly surged upward, too aggressively, too early. The Japanese pilot overcommitted, climbing into a glide that would overshoot the bomber slightly. McCampbell's trap was working. The escort's trajectory would leave it exposed, out of position for at least 3 seconds after the dive. 3 seconds was enough. Fire. The Hellcat spat flame. 2 short bursts, never a long one. A line of 50 cal rounds stitched upward into the bomber's empennage. The tail tore apart instantly. The bomber pitched nose down, violently, the G-forces ripping its wings into a shallow spiral. Smoke billowed from its shattered rear fuselage as it fell, slicing a dark column through the bomber stream. 5 down. But there was no triumph, only acceleration. McCampbell yanked the Hellcat out of the dive, the ocean swelling upward like a rising slab of steel. G-forces smashed him back into the seat, the edges of his vision grayed, his breath stalled, trapped somewhere between lungs and mask. He fought not the dive, but his own biology. His heartbeat thundered, his arms shook, his ribs felt like they were tightening around his heart. He forced air into his lungs, a slow, brutal inhale, then another. The world returned, and with it the countdown, because now came the most dangerous part, the climb. The part the escorts were waiting for, the part where he shed speed, where his aircraft became a slow-moving target, where the aggressive escort could catch him if it predicted his ascent vector. He angled left, unexpectedly, cutting sideways instead of up. A lateral climb, risky, inefficient. But unpredictability was his only shield now. The escort's silhouette flashed behind him, overshooting the bomber it had aimed to protect. It twisted violently, searching for the attacker. But McCampbell was already sliding back into the sunlight's blinding curtain. 9:05:30 a.m., the second half of the countdown began. He needed altitude again, urgently. Without altitude, the dive died. Without the dive, the tactic ended. Without the tactic, the fleet burned. The escorts were climbing faster now. The bombers were tightening again. And the sun, his greatest ally, was rising toward an angle where glare would weaken. He had maybe 5 minutes left before the sunblind dive ceased to exist. 5 minutes to tear as much of the bomber formation apart as one man could. 5 minutes before the Japanese war machine regained full control of the sky. 5 minutes before the Essex faced the storm without him. He pushed the Hellcat higher. The next attack would be the hardest yet. And the countdown was still ticking. At 09:06 a.m., McCampbell broke through the upper haze and into clean sunlight again. The Hellcat groaned under the strain of another steep climb, engine heat bleeding through the floor panels, the cockpit reeking faintly of hot oil and gunpowder. Below him, the Japanese formation, though shaken, had not broken. If anything, it looked more focused now, more determined. The brief confusion was dissolving into discipline again. He didn't have many climbs left in him. The aircraft didn't either, and the escorts were learning too fast. The window was collapsing. But there, at the edge of the formation, McCampbell spotted his next opening. 2 bombers drifting slightly apart, struggling to re-establish spacing after the chaos of the last dive. A seam. A narrow one. Narrower than any he'd taken that morning. But seams were where giants fell. He veered the Hellcat right, adjusting his climb just enough to realign with the seam without revealing himself. The sun held its position behind him, less blinding now, but still workable. still enough to mask his silhouette for a few more precious seconds. He stabilized at the peak. No breath, no hesitation, no emotion. Just calculation. Then he dove. The roar enveloped him instantly, a physical force shaking the cockpit as gravity snapped the Hellcat downward. The two bombers expanded in his windscreen, one slightly ahead of the other, the second lined up perfectly behind its leader. A double-kill window. A gift created only by panic and timing. He took it. A short burst. The lead bomber erupted, fire spraying backward in a horizontal sheet. Its wing peeled off, spinning like a metal leaf caught in a hurricane. He did not watch it fall. He had already shifted aim. A second burst. The trailing bomber's canopy shattered. Smoke poured from the nose as the aircraft rolled violently, losing altitude in a widening spiral. 7. He was 7 kills in, with the fleet still staring up at the sky, waiting for the next wave to descend. But the Japanese escorts no longer moved like confused hunters. Their patterns tightened, their arcs sharpened. The aggressive pilot, the one who had sensed the ambush earlier, was climbing again. Higher, faster, almost at the glare line. And this time the pilot didn't climb blindly. He climbed with purpose. McCampbell felt a thin ripple of danger tighten across his shoulders. The trap had sprung once, but it would not spring again. Not on this enemy. He pitched the Hellcat into a brutal sideways dive, cutting across the formation at an unfamiliar angle. Not up, not down. A diagonal slash that no Doctrine predicted. The escorts peeled toward his last known descent vector, only to find empty sky. By the time they realized the mistake, McCampbell was already drifting back into the blind quadrant. But it wasn't perfect. Not anymore. The sun was rising higher. The glare was thinning. His invisibility was fading. He didn't have many dives left. He reached altitude again, slower than before. The aircraft rattled, wings flexing under accumulated stress. Ammunition counters told him the truth he had been ignoring. He had enough for 3 attacks. 4 if he risked emptying the belts completely. 3 or 4 dives, that was all. Below, the bombers surged forward again, closing distance on the fleet. Destroyers tightened their formation. Gunners braced for the approach. Every second the Japanese maintained altitude was a second closer to release range. McCampbell had to break the formation, not by killing every plane, impossible, but by collapsing its rhythm. Destroy rhythm, destroy the attack. He tipped into another dive. The sun barely protected him now. It was no longer a shield, only a shimmer. Enough to distort, not enough to hide. The 8th bomber loomed beneath him, a mid-formation Judy flying slightly lower than its neighbors. He fired a controlled burst. The aircraft detonated so violently that a spray of debris struck the bomber beside it, forcing that plane out of position. 8. He pulled up again, harder than his body wanted. The G-forces punched through his limbs, making his vision flicker at the edges. And then, a shadow. Not a bomber, a fighter. The aggressive escort had predicted the climb path this time. The Zero burst from below, overshooting him by inches, tracers slicing the air where his cockpit had been a fraction of a second earlier. McCampbell banked violently, the Hellcat shaking as though it might tear in half. He disappeared behind the edge of another sunburst, but the safety was temporary. The Japanese pilot had learned the pattern. He had minutes left, maybe less. If he climbed normally, the escort would intercept him. If he remained low, he lost the dive advantage. If he broke off entirely, the fleet would face the full weight of the bomber assault. So he chose the only option left, a broken climb. Instead of arcing upward smoothly, he stuttered the ascent. Short climb, level out, hop upward, level again. A jerking, unpredictable motion designed not for efficiency, but for invisibility. The escort overshot again, miscalculating the vector. He reached altitude, barely, and one bomber remained positioned in the exact corridor he needed, the 9th. He dove, a final, clean burst. The bomber disintegrated mid-air, its wreckage scattering across the formation like shrapnel. 9 kills. 10 minutes. The sky trembled. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. At 09:08 a.m., the moment the 9th bomber broke apart under his guns and spiraled into the sea, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. For 10 minutes, McCampbell had carved through the formation like a silent blade, killing with angles rather than rage, physics rather than speed. But now, suddenly, violently, the spell shattered. The Japanese formation finally understood. Not a guess, not an instinct, not a flicker of suspicion in a gunner's eyes. Understanding. The escort swarmed upward, abandoning lateral screens entirely. The bombers tightened into a desperate, compressed knot. The enemy commander, whoever he was, finally recognized that the attack wasn't random, wasn't scattered, wasn't chaotic. It had shape, rhythm, precision. It was the work of one man exploiting a single invisible quadrant of the sky. And now that quadrant was burning away. At McCampbell's altitude, the sun no longer provided absolute cover. Shadows sharpened, glare thinned. His silhouette, once swallowed by light, now flickered in and out like a ghost struggling to stay incorporeal. The 10th dive would have been possible 10 minutes ago. Now it was a death sentence. And then came the part no gun camera ever records, the moment no medal describes, the silence after the final shot. McCampbell leveled out low, dangerously low, the Hellcat's wings slicing the denser air just above the ocean surface. Spray trails flicked upward. The engine growled at a pitch that hinted at structural fatigue. His body felt bruised from the repeated G-loads. His breathing came shallow, forced. He should have turned away, should have taken the escape vector, should have climbed back toward the fleet. But he didn't. He circled once, slow, deliberate, because he had to confirm something with his own eyes. Not for the kill count, not for pride, but because he needed to know whether the formation still had the strength to continue its run. So he climbed again, just enough. Not for attack, for assessment. He lifted the Hellcat's nose, gained a few hundred feet, and rolled slightly left to see the formation from a skewed angle. What he saw wasn't triumph. It was damage, but not defeat. 9 bombers gone, but more than 60 remained. The escorts, though scattered, were regaining structure. The aggressive Japanese pilot, his shadow in this battle, had rejoined the high flank and was now scanning the glare line with hungry precision. And the bombers still headed toward the fleet. Their line was bent, their spacing ruined, their rhythm fractured, but their intent remained. McCampbell's fingers tightened on the control stick. His gun belts were nearly empty. His engine temperature was red-lining. His body trembled with exhaustion. He had nothing left to strike with. Yet even without firing another shot, he still had one weapon, his presence. An enemy formation that knows it is hunted behaves differently. It second-guesses, it hesitates, it delays. And delay was the currency the U.S. fleet needed. He banked the Hellcat again, feinting a climb as if preparing another dive. The Japanese escorts reacted instantly, pulling upward in a chaotic scramble to block an attack that would never come. That feint alone bought 20 seconds. 20 seconds of confusion. 20 seconds of hesitation. He repeated the maneuver. Another false climb. Another defensive overreaction. The formation slowed. Bombers drifted out of sync again. Escorts bled speed, climbing uselessly. From the ocean below, American gunners saw something they had not expected. Bombers arriving late. Not destroyed, not defeated, but delayed. And delay changed everything. Because in those 20 seconds, American fighters scrambled from other carriers began to close distance. Anti-aircraft crews calibrated firing solutions. Damage control teams braced. Command officers repositioned decks for impact. 20 seconds was the difference between being caught unprepared and meeting the enemy with teeth bared. Meanwhile, McCampbell flew the Hellcat like a wounded bird faking strength. His feints grew weaker. His engine sputtered. Ammunition counters blinked near empty. He pushed the aircraft to angles it resented and speeds it could barely maintain. But the illusion held. To the Japanese formation, he still looked like the attacker who had descended from the sun 9 times in 10 minutes. A phantom who could reappear at any instant for the 10th. That threat mattered more than the 10th attack itself. When he finally broke away, when he finally allowed the exhaustion to pull him toward a safer vector, the escorts did not chase. They stayed with the bombers, guarding a sky they no longer trusted. And that hesitation, that fear of the unseen 10th dive, fractured their timing completely. The formation's tempo died. The bombers began their approach disunited, disorganized, and above a fleet that was now fully awake, fully armed, and fully ready. McCampbell watched from distance as anti-aircraft tracers rose to meet the incoming wave. Fighters from the Essex and nearby carriers slashed into the broken formation. Explosions lit the sky. Smoke trails corkscrewed downward. The Japanese attack degraded from a spear point into a scattering storm. He had no rounds left to fire. He had no altitude left to climb. He had no dives left to make. But his job was done. He had broken their shape. He had broken their timing. He had broken their confidence. And in doing so, he had saved ships he could no longer see. Silence filled the cockpit now, broken only by the rattling hum of an exhausted engine. His hands ached, his head pounded. Sweat cooled across his spine. And through the canopy, he saw the sky as it truly was, not a battlefield, a ledger. 1 man, 10 minutes, 9 bombers erased, dozens delayed, thousands of sailors still alive because the sun had covered him long enough. He turned the Hellcat toward home, but the legend was only beginning. At 09:27 a.m., McCampbell's Hellcat touched down on the deck of the Essex with a shudder that felt more like a surrender than a landing. The aircraft rolled to a halt, engines sputtering, wings trembling, an exhausted machine returning from a sky that should have destroyed it. When the canopy opened, deck crews expected a swaggering ace, a triumphant hero, a man electrified by the carnage he had unleashed. Instead, they saw a pilot so drained he could barely lift his goggles. His first words, barely above a whisper, were not about the 9 kills, not about the sunblind dives, not about the deadly geometry he had bent into a weapon. He simply asked, "Did the fleet hold?" The answer, yes, landed heavier than any medal ever would, because in the end, his achievement wasn't measured in kills. It was measured in minutes. The minutes he bought the fleet, the minutes he stole from the enemy, the minutes that became the difference between survival and catastrophe. And while the battle roared on beyond the horizon that day, something else began to take shape. Quietly, inevitably, across the U.S. Navy, across the Pacific, and eventually across the entire world of aerial warfare, the legend of the sunblind dive. Months later, Headquarters Pacific Theater. Reports drifted across command desks. First, 9 kills in 10 minutes. Then the full accounting of the bomber formation he broke. Then the confirmation from fleet officers. McCampbell's interference disrupted the attack so severely that the Japanese squadrons never regained coordination. Analysts studied the geometry. Tacticians studied the climb-dive pattern. But pilots, especially rookies, studied the idea behind it. A single man, alone, outnumbered nearly 100 to 1, used physics and sunlight to turn the sky itself into a weapon. It didn't feel real. It felt like myth. Stories whispered in ready rooms. A tale pilots recited to steady their hands before takeoff. He dove out of the sun and erased 9 planes. He made 90 pilots blind. He stalled an entire attack with nothing but altitude. McCampbell himself downplayed it. He always said the same thing. "I just used what the sun gave me." But the truth ran deeper. He had done something that Doctrine said was impossible. He had confronted overwhelming force not with brute strength, but with a paradox. The higher you climb into danger, the safer you become, if your enemy refuses to look into the light. Years later, aviation schools, strategic debriefings. The sunblind dive became more than a legend. It became a case study. Instructors dissected how altitude becomes energy. Cadets analyzed how glare becomes camouflage. Generals referenced how a single tactic, executed by a single pilot, could fracture a coordinated assault and prevent devastation. McCampbell's name became shorthand for tactical audacity through elegance, proof that warfare rewards clarity of thought as much as courage. Long after the war, pilots who never met him still spoke his name with a quiet reverence, the way soldiers speak of a blade that cuts cleaner than expected. Not loud, not dramatic, but unforgettable. His Medal of Honor citation told the formal story. History told the official one, but pilots told the real one. The sky bent for him because he understood how to bend it first. Decades later, veterans' reunions, museum halls. Old men walked under hanging aircraft, tracing their hands along aluminum skins worn by age. Some paused beneath the Hellcat that bore his insignia. They stared upward, toward a ceiling lit by museum lights, imagining the glare of the sun instead. To them, the story was not about 9 kills, not even about saving a fleet. It was about what war sometimes demands: the ability to see what others cannot, to act where others hesitate, to rise where others turn away. McCampbell's tactic lives on because it embodies a truth deeper than combat. A truth about clarity under pressure, precision under chaos, and courage expressed not through noise, but through thought. He didn't scream into battle. He didn't fight for glory. He didn't rely on luck. He simply ascended into the light and made the light itself his ally. Final afterglow. At air weight 58 a.m., surrounded by 90 enemies, he climbed straight into the sun. At 09:08 a.m., 9 of those enemies no longer existed. And long after the wreckage sank, long after the smoke drifted away, long after the fleet survived to fight another day, the legend remained suspended there. in that space between sunlight and death where one man learned to disappear in order to win.